Learning objective E is tell if a inverse of a graph is actually a function. So assume that we were given a particular equation, we found its inverse. They're going to want to say, hey, is this inverse a function? Remember, definition of a function is if it passes the vertical line test. So if they give you an original equation, I can do the vertical line test to see if it's a function. But what if I want to know about its inverse? I first would have to find the inverse and then do the vertical line test to that. There is a shortcut, and I'll show you that. It's called the horizontal line test. What the horizontal line test says is if you take an existing function, for example here, and you draw any horizontal line, it'll only cross in one spot. This right here crosses in one spot, which means when I find it, the inverse of that blue graph, and I graph it, I know that will pass the vertical line test. This guy right here, so this is a function. This guy right here will not be a function. Again, this is the original equation or graph someone would have given me, and they would say, hey, find the inverse for me, tell me if it's a function. If I don't want to go through all that work, I can do a shortcut. If I draw a horizontal line, I'm going to notice it actually crosses in two spots, which means when I do find the inverse and I graph it, that inverse would actually fail the vertical line test. So it's a great shortcut so I don't have to do all that math. So let me go ahead and we'll do some examples and I'll show you how it works. So the first question is determine whether the inverse of this particular graph is a function. And we're going to end up using our graphing calculators for this. And they want us to find the inverse. I'm just going to do a shortcut. I would get my graphing calculator out, and I would go to the y equals button and just type. It would default as y equals. I would type x, caret 3 plus 1, and I'd hit graph. When I do that, I will tell you the graph is going to look something like this, which is the original graph. Their question is, when you find the inverse, will that be a function? All you need to do is imagine drawing all these horizontal lines, and you're testing to see if there's at least one that crosses at more than one point. If I draw the line here, it crosses at 1. Here, crosses at 1. Here, crosses at 1. It'll never cross in more than one point, which tells me I know when I find the inverse that the inverse will pass its vertical line test. So I don't have to find the inverse. I can just come up and say, yes, inverse will be a function. Well, they are asking me to find the inverse, so I'll go ahead and do the math for that. Let's write down the original function. I'm going to change that to y, remember. And let's get, and now flip-flop x and y. And then solve for y. To solve for y, I'm going to subtract 1 from both sides. Remember from the last chapter, we do know how to get rid of that little cubed. What you have to do is multiply this side by a little 1/3 and this entire side by a little 1/3. So the equation will actually look like this is what you would type. If you type this into your calculator, you will get a graph that looks something like, it'll go something like this. This red graph right here, if I were to apply the vertical line test to it like it was an original graph, would pass the vertical line test, so it is a function. But again, I did not have to do that. I could just do a shortcut. Well, let's look at another. This guy right here, determine whether the inverse of f of x equals x squared is a function. In my calculator, I would just type this function, which is y equals x squared. It's a standard parabola, by the way, which is going to look like this. Does this pass the horizontal line test? Clearly, this graph will cross in more than one point, which means when I do find the inverse will fail the vertical line test and will not be a function. So, is it going to be a function? No, it will not be a function. Fine, they would like us to find the inverse. We can do that. Again, flip-flop the variables. How do you get rid of a 1/2 power? You do a little, or a squared power, you do a little 1/2, do a little 1/2. So the equation is going to be this. If you sketch that, I will tell you it's going to look something like this because it will be a little plus and minus. Remember 1/2 power, by the way, just means the square root of x. And this is going to be a plus and minus. A lot of people will forget that. It's a tricky part to it. If you look at the black graph I just drew, I can tell if I was back in kind of our general algebra class that this failed the vertical line test, so it's not a function. Again, I didn't have to go that far and do it because I used our new trick, the horizontal line test.